What role did international trade play in the outbreak of the Civil War? Although we tend to think that the Civil War was caused only by the issue of the morality of slavery, the conflict was really driven by practical and mercantile concerns. International trade played a major role in the development which led to the outbreak of the American Civil War. My first point is that trade disputes in the textile industry played a role in the abolitionist movement. Secondly, British investment drove the South to rely on cotton. And third, the industrialization in the cotton trade led to inhumane conditions for slaves, which helped galvanize the abolitionist movement. So the first point is that conflicts in the cloth industry played a role in the abolitionist movement. With the newer product of cotton in the market, European wool manufacturers were forced to compete with them. William Wilberforce, who was responsible for the abolishment of the slave trade in Britain, quote, William Wilberforce operated as the official parliamentary spokesman for the wool trade. This was said by B.K. Bangura. So he was also responsible for the wool trade in Britain. Many other abolitionists, such as John Brown, were connected to the wool industry. So in other words, they would benefit from it doing well. The Baptists, who are morally motivated and bootlegger, financially motivated, seem to have a partnership in historic changes. A modern example would be when the government was trying to make gambling legal. This would hurt the Native Americans, who were the only ones allowed to have casinos. So one tribe, the Choctaw, paid Jack Abramoff $85 million to make sure gambling would not be made legal. So Abramoff paid a lot of money to Christian organizations so that they could protest against gambling. This idea of the Baptists and the bootleggers can be seen in the textile industry, where the wool industry is in support of abolitioning slavery so that the cotton from the South would become more expensive, so wool would become more popular again. My second point is that British investment in the cotton industry would allow the South to rely on cotton. Wool traders wanted to make cotton more expensive. So the British wanted the British people found out that they could buy cheaper cotton from the South because slavery was still a thing there. So they would invest. And Brian Tumbor says, the South was supplying Britain with 48% of its needs by 1830. That percentage would rise to 70% eventually. So this is talking about cotton. British merchant banks would now buy large amounts of land in the South that belonged to the Indians who were evicted. They loaned the land to the farmers, which made cotton the South's dominant crop, on which its economy depended. My third point is that industrialization in the cotton trade led to inhumane conditions for slaves. Now that British banks were giving loans to American plantations, cotton plantations grew, especially large on the banks of the Mississippi. Plantations were large in an industrialized scale. They paid premium for slaves, and there were just warehouses full of slaves. It was pretty horrible. So, because there were so many slaves, they did have the option to revolt against the few white masters. So, the masters, to restrain the slaves, they instilled harsh and cruel punishments. This gave to make them be fearful and obedient. However, this strengthened the abolitionist cause. As David Barry Gasper said, punishments tended to be harsher on large, more impersonally organized plantations. So basically how it used to be before the plantations were so huge, slaves were kind of more like part of the family. So you wouldn't like whip your slave or anything like that. But now that slaves didn't really have any relationship at all, they were even like humans, people didn't care. They would do so many inhumane things. Such methods of punishment roused abolitionists such as Stephen Foster. He was inspired by Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. So he wrote the song My Old Kentucky Home, in which a slave laments saying goodbye to Kentucky when he is sold down south, probably to be killed on the plantation. So in conclusion, despite the opinion that the Civil War was mostly driven by moral arguments, international trade played a major role leading to the outbreak of the Civil War. First, trade disputes in the cloth industry influenced the abolitionist movement. Secondly, British investment in the cotton industry strengthened the South's reliance upon it. And thirdly, the industrialization and growth of the cotton trade led to inhumane conditions for slaves, strengthening the abolitionist movement. Thank you.